The sun hung low over the canyon, a molten coin suspended in a sky the color of rust and sorrow. Dust swirled around Clara Belle Hartman's boots, with each hesitant step, the fine particles scratching at the raw skin of her bruised ankles. She had walked for what felt like hours, though in truth it had been only a few dozen minutes, through a landscape that was both merciless and strangely beautiful. Sagebrush bowed under the wind, and the distant cries of unseen birds punctuated the silence like mournful notes of a piano. Her dress was torn, a pale ghost of fabric against her skin, and the faint iron scent of blood clung to her hair. Clara Belle's hands trembled, not merely from the ache of bruises along her ribs and forearms, but from the knowledge of what awaited her. Frontier justice had its own rhythm, unforgiving, swift, and as she now understood, arbitrary. She had angered a local landowner, foolishly or not, and the price was punishment. And so here she was, forced to submit to a life she had never imagined, cooking and cleaning for the mountain man, Jedediah Crane, whose reputation stretched like a shadow across the hills. The cabin came into view, perched stubbornly against the rugged spine of the mountains. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, winding toward the heavens like a plea. The structure was simple, uncompromising, logs stacked unevenly, roof sagging in places, yet it had a quiet dignity. Clara Belle's footsteps faltered at the threshold. The smell of pine, burning wood, and earth greeted her, a strange comfort that did nothing to ease the tremor in her chest. Jed was there, a man carved of the mountains themselves. His hair was wild and dark, streaked with gray, his beard a tangled testament to solitude. His eyes were storm clouds, observing her silently, the way a hawk might watch a sparrow hesitate on a branch. He said nothing, merely gestured toward the cabin door, and Clara Belle obeyed. Every step inside felt like surrender, yet with each breath she tried to anchor herself in a fragile dignity. The interior was sparse. A hearth dominated one wall, blackened with years of flame. Iron pots and skillets hung like sentinels, their surfaces dulled with constant use. A single bed, roughly made, occupied a corner, and a small window framed the mountain landscape beyond, golden light spilling across the wooden floorboards. Clara Belle felt the weight of eyes on her, though Jed did not move from the doorway. He was testing her, she realized, in the quietest way possible. Every action she took would be scrutinized. Every misstep could provoke his wrath. Her first tasks were simple: tend the fire, fetch water, prepare the evening meal. And yet, in those ordinary motions, Clara Belle found herself measured by more than skill. Her courage, her endurance, her very spirit were all on display. She chopped wood, the sound of the axe echoing against the log walls, each strike resonating in her chest, as if to remind her of her own fragility and strength intertwined. As she worked, memories drifted unbidden, like smoke curling through a cabin vent. She saw herself in a sunlit meadow, the laughter of children ringing, the scent of wildflowers clinging to her fingers. Her father's voice, low and steady, warning her of the dangers beyond the settlement. Her mother weaving cloth, humming lullabies into the rhythm of daily life. Those were lives that felt distant, almost unreal now, yet she carried them with her, tucked between the bruises and dirt, a fragile ember of self she refused to extinguish. The mountain man observed silently as she cooked, his presence as solid and unyielding as the timbers around her. She noted the way his hands moved when he stacked firewood outside, deliberate and careful, each log finding its place with unspoken precision. Even the way he fed a stray dog that lingered near the cabin hinted at a complexity she could not yet name. And though fear lingered in her chest, a small pulse of curiosity threaded through the tension, a sense that perhaps this man was more than the reputation whispered across the settlement. Evening fell like a heavy curtain. The sky painted in shades of violet and deep indigo. Clara Belle set the meal on the rough-hewn table, her hands shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of shame and defiance battling within her. She met Jed's eyes, and for the first time there was acknowledgement, a silent, measured evaluation. He said nothing, yet the intensity of his gaze spoke volumes. It was a challenge, though not one of words. "Do not break," he seemed to say, and perhaps, just perhaps, I will not either. The cabin settled into its natural rhythm, the crackle of fire, the occasional scrape of metal against wood, the wind sighing through the cracks. Clara Belle wondered, with a quiet, almost desperate hope, whether she would ever leave this place. Yet even as doubt threatened, a spark of resolve began to kindle. She would endure. She would adapt. She would survive. And in the spaces between smoke and silence, between firelight and shadow, she sensed that something profound was shifting within her, the fragile, embered core of a woman learning that even in punishment there could be power. As night deepened, Jed moved to his corner, settling with a quiet finality. Clara Belle lingered at the table, tracing patterns in the worn wood with her fingers, inhaling the scent of pine and ash and letting the silence enfold her. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew with an almost sacred certainty that she would face it on her own terms. The mountains were vast and indifferent, but within their shadow she was beginning to reclaim herself. Days settled over the cabin like gentle dust, thick yet soft, wrapping every corner in a slow, unhurried rhythm. Clara Belle Hartman rose with the sun, the first pale threads of light seeping through the small window, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny specters in the morning air. She moved with a careful deliberation, tending the fire, washing the pots, chopping wood, the simple acts of survival becoming her mantra. In the quiet, she began to discover an unexpected rhythm, a fragile symmetry in the motions that had once felt like chains. Jedediah Crane remained a silent presence, a living shadow in the cabin. His movements were deliberate, each action precise yet unhurried, stacking logs, tending the hearth, listening to the wind as if it carried secrets meant only for him. Clara Belle watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the subtle kindnesses. The way he fed the stray dog, gently scratching behind its ears. The careful way he patched a hole in the roof before it grew into a storm's threat. Each small act unnoticed by the world beyond whispered stories of a man not entirely unyielding, a man shaped by isolation and survival rather than cruelty alone. In the evenings, Clara Belle would sit by the hearth, her hands busy with a task, yet her mind wandering through memories that refused to be silenced. She thought of the homestead she had lost, of laughter that once seemed eternal, of her mother's soft voice guiding her through chores. Shame, which had once clenched her chest like a fist, softened into quiet reflection. She discovered that resilience was not the absence of fear, but the ability to breathe through it, to move gently in its presence and find the ember of self within. She began small acts of defiance. A pinch of wild herbs in the stew, a rearrangement of the firewood in a pattern that pleased her own eyes, humming a tune from home as she scrubbed the cabin floor. These tiny rebellions were hers alone, unnoticed, yet each left a trace of her autonomy, a reminder that even here, in the mountain man's domain, she was not entirely broken. Jed noticed, of course. He did not comment, did not interfere, but the brief flicker in his storm-gray eyes spoke volumes, a recognition, not of disobedience, but of strength. Outside, the mountains held their eternal vigil. Wind whispered through pines, carrying the scent of frost and earth, and the river below gurgled like a distant memory of something untamed. Clara Belle would sometimes pause, hands still, heart alert to the subtle music of the wilderness. There was a meditative quality to the isolation, a space in which she could breathe freely even while trapped by circumstance. The forest became a confidant, and the mountains, stern yet impartial teachers, revealed lessons in patience, observation, and the quiet dignity of endurance. Old Martha, the neighboring settler, occasionally visited, bringing news and a gentle human touch that reminded Clara Belle of life beyond the peaks. She spoke softly, offering kindness in the form of bread, a word of encouragement, a knowing glance that seemed to understand more than Clara Belle could say. Through these interactions, Clara Belle realized that her world had not entirely shrunk, that connections still existed beyond the cabin walls, and that the strength to endure could be nurtured in subtle, tender ways. Then there was Sam Rust McGraw, a wandering prospector who passed near the cabin occasionally, his presence a fleeting promise of the outside world. He spoke of towns, of opportunities, of life unrestricted by snow or stone, but Clara Belle listened and smiled quietly, the weight of her inner transformation growing with each passing day. She did not long for the old freedom in the same way. She had begun to appreciate a different sort of power, one wrought from resilience and self-possession. Jed and Clara Belle fell into an unspoken cadence. They moved through the cabin, through the daily rituals, their interactions minimal yet loaded with unarticulated understanding. Silence became a language in itself. She prepared meals, he ate. She chopped wood, he stacked. A glance, a half-smile, a pause in work. These were their conversations. The quiet tension between them deepened, threaded with respect and a subtle curiosity that neither could name aloud. At night, Clara Belle would linger by the fire, tracing the grains of the table with her fingers, reflecting on the transformation within. The fear that had once gripped her chest like iron chains had loosened, replaced by a slow-burning courage. She realized that endurance was not merely surviving, but asserting the self in small, deliberate acts. The cabin had become more than a prison, it was a crucible. She had emerged from each day tempered, stronger, with the quiet knowledge that she could face whatever came next. Jed, too, was changing. The mountain man, who had once treated her presence as a burden or obligation, began to shift imperceptibly. His recognition of her inner fire, her quiet defiance, sparked something unfamiliar in him, a cautious respect. He observed her, not with suspicion, but with a tentative acknowledgement that she was not a mere victim, but a participant in their shared wilderness. And though he would never speak it aloud, the unbroken connection between them was a current running beneath the cabin floor, a rhythm neither dared to name. By the end of the second week, Clara Belle had learned the subtle art of coexistence. The mountains no longer seemed oppressive but alive, vibrant with the music of wind, river, and wildlife. Her hands bore the marks of labor, yes, but they were also proof of survival, endurance, and adaptation. And when she looked at Jed, standing at the threshold of the cabin, eyes shadowed by the fading light, she no longer saw merely the man who had punished her, but a complex, solitary soul navigating his own hardships. Unknowable yet undeniably human, the tension remained, of course, an undercurrent beneath the shared silence. Yet it was no longer the sharp edge of fear, but a quiet, patient awareness that both were learning, slowly, how to inhabit the same space without annihilating one another. Clara Belle understood that freedom might not arrive in the form of flight from the mountains, but in the reclamation of self within them. And as the fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney, she allowed herself the faintest smile, knowing that the days ahead would test her still, but that she was no longer the woman who had trembled at the cabin door. The first light of dawn seeped through the cabin window like liquid gold, painting the wooden floor with streaks of warmth. Clara Belle Hartman stirred, stretching her aching arms as the fire's last embers whispered in the hearth. Outside, the mountains were cloaked in a fragile mist, the pines bending gently under the morning breeze, their needles shimmering with frost. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to shift, some inevitable turning of fate. Jedediah Crane sat at the table, the lines of his face softened by the dim light. He regarded her with a quiet intensity, and for the first time, he spoke in full sentences, his voice low, gravelly, carrying the weight of winter storms and solitude. "You can go," he said. No hesitation, no threat, only those two simple words. The offer hung in the cabin like the scent of pine smoke, tangible and impossible to ignore. Clara Belle froze, the chop of wood in her memory still echoing in her chest, the rhythm of days spent here threading through her limbs. Go, leave, escape, freedom. The words she had once longed for, now whispered like a temptress in the corners of her mind. Yet when she looked at Jed, at the silent acknowledgement in his storm-gray eyes, she understood that freedom was no longer simply about leaving. It had become something far more complex, something wrought from endurance, self-possession, and quiet courage. She shook her head. The motion slow, deliberate. "No," she said, her voice firm yet melodic, carrying the weight of all the days and nights spent here. The labor, the reflection, the small triumphs over fear and shame. "I will not go." Jed's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered features. He leaned back, the chair creaking under the sudden shift of tension. Silence fell again, heavier than the walls of the cabin themselves. For the first time, Clara Belle saw him not as a captor, but as a man navigating his own code, equally surprised to encounter such defiance. The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the cabin windows, carrying the scent of snow and storm. Jed moved to the door, peering out at the approaching gray cloud of winter. The mountains, which had always seemed indifferent, were now a living force, pressing against them, testing them. And in that moment, the choice was no longer merely about staying or leaving, but about survival, trust, and the raw pulse of life at the edge of the wilderness. A spark leapt from the hearth, landing on the wooden floor. Clara Belle's instincts surged. She was no longer trembling, no longer shrinking. She sprang to action, grabbing a wet cloth and smothering the small flame, her hands steady, her breath controlled. Jed watched her, the tension between them crackling in the space like the fire had, a silent acknowledgement that she was capable, unbroken, fierce in ways he had not anticipated. Outside, the storm broke with sudden ferocity, snow pelting the cabin walls, wind bending the trees as though the world itself sought to drive them apart. Jed barked instructions, though not harshly, and Clara Belle followed without hesitation. Together they reinforced the cabin, bracing doors, stacking logs against the wind, moving with the unspoken rhythm that had been growing between them for weeks. In this crucible of nature's wrath, the quiet tension of days past transformed into an undeniable partnership, hours passed in frantic, synchronized labor. Their muscles ached, clothes were soaked with snow and sweat, and the cabin moaned under the storm's relentless assault. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a strange intimacy, a deep, unspoken bond formed in shared adversity. Clara Belle realized that the mountain man's harshness had not been cruelty alone, but a mirror, reflecting her own resilience and determination back to her. As the storm waned, leaving behind a world transformed, sparkling under fresh snow, Clara Belle and Jed collapsed by the hearth, their breathing slow, their hands marked by frostbite and toil. The fire crackled, tiny sparks rising like fleeting stars, and the mountains beyond were serene once more, silent witnesses to the endurance of two souls. Jed studied her, his expression softened, almost unrecognizable from the stern, storm-clouded face that had greeted her weeks ago. "You could have left," he said quietly, the weight of regret, pride, and something unspoken threading through his voice. Clara Belle shook her head again, a small smile playing on her lips. "I could have," she said, voice steady, warm with newfound conviction. "But I won't. Not because I need to stay, but because I choose to." The words hung in the cabin like smoke and sunlight intertwined. And in that choice, she discovered a profound truth. Freedom was not merely a door to the world beyond the mountains, but the reclamation of self, the quiet assertion of will against fear, against circumstance, against the invisible chains that had once sought to bind her. Jed reached out, his large, rough hand brushing against hers, tentative yet deliberate. No words were needed. In that touch was acknowledgement, respect, and a fragile intimacy that neither had dared name. The cabin, which had once been a place of punishment, now felt like sanctuary, a crucible where pain had been transformed into endurance, fear into courage, and captivity into choice. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the snow and casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Clara Belle stood at the window, looking out over the mountains, the valleys, the endless horizon. And though the world remained vast, wild, and indifferent, she no longer felt small. She had survived, endured, and in doing so, had discovered a power that was hers alone. Jed stood beside her, silent yet present, a steady force in the midst of a wilderness that could be as harsh as it was beautiful. And for the first time, Clara Belle felt the thrill of true agency. not in running from the mountains, but in standing within them, unbroken, defiant, and alive. The final scene lingered in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, the hearth warm, the snow outside glimmering, two figures bound not by duty or fear, but by recognition of strength, resilience, and the slow, luminous blossoming of human connection. The mountains watched silently, eternal and vast, as if bearing witness to the transformation of a beaten settler into a woman who refused to be conquered. The storm had passed. The wind softened, and in that delicate calm, Clara Belle Hartman allowed herself a deep breath, a laugh that was quiet but triumphant, and a smile that spoke of journeys yet to come. She had chosen her place, her path, and her freedom, not through escape, but through refusal, endurance, and the quiet assertion of self. And in that choice, the mountain man's harsh eyes softened, the cabin hummed with warmth, and the wilderness finally seemed to recognize them both.